Two Christian apologists made two big mistakes in a recent debate with a well-known Muslim apologist. In this video, I want to do three things. First, I want to address two big mistakes I saw in how Mike and Than responded to the Muslim arguments. Two, I want to offer suggestions for how they can do better going forward. And three, I want to give you two free resources for the topics discussed in this video that will help you learn more. One of these resources is brand new and might just be one of the best resources available for defending the deity of Christ, so you will want to stay tuned for that. This is In Philosopher's Garb. I'm a Christian theologian. Let's get started by looking at the first mistake. Mistake number one, failing to clarify what they meant by the statement, Jesus is God. In the debate, the Muslim they were debating, Paul, set up a logical trap for Than and Mike. Mike and Than saw the trap, they acknowledged the trap, and then they proceeded to just fling themselves into the trap anyways. Then they spent a decent chunk of time trying to crawl out of the trap that they knowingly walked into. To illustrate this, I want to show you a few short clips. In this first clip, Paul is asking if God knows everything.
I mean, is he all-knowing? Does he possess complete and unlimited knowledge of everything that exists or has existed or will exist?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
You both agree with that? Excellent. My next
Presently,
question is,
yes.
do you believe Jesus is God?
Yeah, we know where you're going, but yeah,
Yeah.
we believe Jesus is God. Yeah.
Right. So Jesus is God. Therefore, it follows very simply and logically that he must have possessed complete and unlimited knowledge.
So the tactic here is that after the trap is sprung, Paul is going to point to the fact that Jesus didn't know things in the New Testament, with the most famous example being that Jesus didn't know the hour of his second coming. So Paul is essentially arguing as follows. Premise 1. If Jesus was God, Jesus knew everything. Premise 2. Jesus didn't know everything. 3. Conclusion. Therefore, Jesus was not God. Paul makes a similar argument about God's immortality. Let's see that real quick.
Is God immortal?
Yes.
Yes.
He is. Oh, I see.
Mhm.
So you don't believe Jesus died on the cross then? If Jesus is God, which you've already said you believe, and God is immortal, because the Bible clearly states that, and you said yes, I would say that Jesus, in your logic, could not have died on the cross because Jesus was God.
So let's talk about how Than and Mike respond to this argument and why it won't work. Than and Mike try to suggest that knowing everything is a non-essential attribute of God. So for instance, I have the property of sitting down, but earlier I had the property of standing up. The property standing and sitting, these are accidental properties that are not essential to my identity. I could have them or I could not have them without ceasing to exist. And the idea is that maybe omniscience is something like that. Maybe omniscience is a property that God could give up and still, be God because it's not essential. Thus, if Christ emptied himself of this property at the incarnation, this is not a contradiction or this is not an issue. And arguing for this, they draw on the ideas of kenotic Christology, which I'm a fan of. In fact, in my doctoral dissertation, it was a defense of kenotic Christology, so I'm on board with that. However, the way that Than and Mike executed this actually doesn't solve the problem that Paul has created, because there's another way to set up a contradiction, and this contradiction can be sprung regardless of if omniscience is an essential attribute. Let's set up a quick timeline to explain this. When Jesus says he doesn't know the hour of his second coming, let's designate the moment he makes that statement as T5. T5 is just a shorthand way to reference that moment of time. Now, at T5, we might ask, is Jesus God? Well, Than and Mike have shown that they will answer yes. That means that at T5, God doesn't know the hour of Jesus' second coming. Now, at that same moment, does the Father know the hour of the second coming? Does he know that at T5? Well, the answer to that has to be yes. Jesus says so, right? Now, is the Father God? Well, I think Mike and Than will likely answer yes to that as well. But that means that at T5, God does know the hour of Jesus' second coming. So this means that there is a specific moment, T5, when God doesn't know the hour of Christ's second coming, and at that same moment, God does know the hour of the second coming. So even if we grant that omniscience is a non-essential attribute of God, that God can't have that and not have it at the same time and in the same sense. That's going to be an issue. Even if you think this is a property God can give up or not, he still either has to have it or he doesn't. So Paul can still press a contradiction against Mike and Than at this point in the dialogue. So Than and Mike's strategy of immediately hopping to kenotic Christology in a discussion of essential attributes, it isn't going to get them out of the trap that they knowingly walked into. So here's what they should have done. When Paul asked, is Jesus God? Mike and Than should have immediately clarified whether they thought Jesus was God in a predicative sense or whether they thought Jesus was God in the sense of identity. This distinction is crucial for successfully navigating these types of traps. So let me briefly explain what this means. Let's take a statement such as, X is Y, right? X and Y can be anything. Plug in what you want, right? The word is in these sentences could convey at least two different meanings. The first meaning it could convey is that of identity. So for instance, suppose we said Batman is Bruce Wayne or water is H2O. In these statements, is being used to identify one thing with the other. If we say X is Y in the sense of identity, that means everything true of X is true of Y and vice versa. However, we often use is in a different manner. We often use the word to predicate a property. So for instance, if you say James is bald, you're not saying James and bald are identical. You're just saying James, I possess this property of baldness. And you can say James is bald, William is bald, but James is not William, and that's logically fine. There's not a contradiction there because it was just predicating a property, not making an identity statement. With this in mind, when confronted with the statement, is Jesus God, we have to ask whether the is in that statement is being used to make an identity statement or is it being used to predicate a property. Put another way, does the statement Jesus is God mean that Jesus is identical to God, or does this statement mean that Jesus is divine? This distinction is crucial because most of the arguments that Paul wants to run, they depend on this statement being one of identity. If Jesus is identical to God and God has the property of being all-knowing, then Jesus must also have that property. But all the traps that Paul wants to set, or almost all of them, they are broken if you just reject that Jesus is identical to God. I'm going to say that again, so listen closely. Almost all of the typical Muslim objections against Jesus that you run into, they pretty much all fail, or the vast majority of them fail, once you recognize that Jesus is not identical to God. And guess what, everybody? I know that both Mike and myself, and I think also Than, we all already reject that Jesus is identical to God. If Jesus is identical to God and the Father is identical to God, that would logically entail that Jesus is identical to the Father, which we all reject as Trinitarians. You see, Mike is a monarchical Trinitarian, so he thinks only the Father is identical to God, and that Jesus can be called God in a predicative sense because he shares the divine nature and is eternally generated by the Father. Now, I don't hold to Mike's model of the Trinity, but I agree that Jesus is God in a predicative sense. So for guys like me and Mike and Than, the second that Paul starts to run these types of scripts, all we need to do, all we got to do is point out that under our models of the Trinity, we don't need to affirm that Jesus possesses all the properties that God possesses. The second Paul asks, is God all-knowing? Mike, since he's a monarchical Trinitarian, should clarify whether God is referring to the Father or not, since for Mike, God is identical to the Father. The second Paul says, is Jesus God? Mike and Than should respond by saying, I don't think Jesus is identical to God, which is the Father, but I think Jesus can be called God because, X or Y, Z, whatever your reason for thinking divinity can be predicated to Jesus. This simple clarification would cut Paul off before he even gets going. So let's switch gears and look at the second major mistake that Than and Mike make. The second mistake they make is that Than and Mike fail to clarify what a sacrifice is, and they seem to deny that Jesus was a sacrifice, which, that's a big blunder, right? They seem to link Christ being a sacrifice with the atonement doctrine of penal substitution. This was in the context of Paul objecting to the idea that God would accept a human sacrifice, and he was using that as an objection to Christianity. Let's look at a short clip of that.
So you believe in human sacrifice. God desires a human sacrifice and nothing but a human sacrifice to atone for sin, or at least Paul teaches that in Romans and many other places.
I just said I reject penal substitution, so why'd you just ask me about it?
Do you believe Jesus' death was a sacrifice at all?
We believe that he was a ransom. As Paul says, he was given as a ransom for many. So it's a ransom to Satan.
I need to know from you, Mike, for the sake of your salvation, are you seriously saying that you believe in a human sacrifice to save your soul?
We believe, again, in, do you want me to explain ransom theory and how this actually plays out? Because I don't think you understand it. You're pushing penal substitution. We don't hold to that.
So there are several problems here. First, rejecting penal substitution is not going to allow you to reject that Jesus is a sacrifice. That doesn't help you when you're confronted with Paul's argument here. I also reject penal substitution, but guess what? The Bible explicitly calls Jesus a sacrifice. Hebrews 9:26 explicitly says Jesus puts away sins by the sacrifice of himself. Paul repeatedly asks Mike if he affirms that Jesus was a sacrifice, which is something that Scripture does require you to do. And Mike keeps pivoting and saying, oh, I believe he was a ransom. Okay, great, Mike. Like, cool. That doesn't answer the question. And the fact that you keep refusing to answer the question outright, and the fact that you keep pivoting to ransom when confronted with this question, that does seem to imply that you do reject that Jesus is a sacrifice. So here's what Mike and Than should have done. They should have said, yes, Jesus is a sacrifice, and let's clarify what a sacrifice is. A sacrifice is a type of offering, and an offering is just a gift given to a deity or a king. It's a tribute. A sacrifice is a type of offering that usually involves the slaughter of an animal. And in the Old Testament, the purpose of a sacrifice on the Day of Atonement was not to placate God's wrath, as Paul seems to be implying. It was to purify sacred space. It was the means through which the priests interceded for the people so that God and man could remain together. Jesus' blood is depicted as purifying the heavens in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews, just as the blood of bulls and goats purifies sacred space in the Old Testament. And contrary to Paul's claims, God does accept human sacrifices. In Romans 12:1, we are told to present our bodies as living sacrifices to God. And the idea here being that we offer ourselves as gifts to God. So the entire back and forth with Paul, in which Mike repeatedly dodges a straightforward question, was unneeded and misleading. And I can understand why Paul might get frustrated in this conversation. So okay, now I want to give you 2 free resources where you can learn more about what I've talked about so far in this video. Free resource number 1. I just recently released an entire book arguing for the deity of Christ, where I speak more in depth about the idea of Jesus being God in a predicative sense, why we can say that, so on and so forth. In that book, I spend roughly 60 pages just addressing objections to Christ's deity, including the typical Muslim arguments that we see Paul use here. I address around 30 potential objections just in one chapter. This book is filled with academic citations for you to incorporate into your own apologetic work. If you were ever engaging in arguments about the deity of Christ, I really recommend you go pick this up because, again, the book is completely free on Amazon. Link to that in the description. The second free resource has to do with the issues of Jesus being a sacrifice and what that means. This is a topic I talk about in my book, The Devil's Disbarment, which is also free, where I talk about Levitical sacrifices. You're going to want to check out chapters 3 and chapter 6 for discussions about Levitical sacrifices and what they do and don't mean. Again, I include citations in that work from, authoritative scholars on this area, which you can incorporate into your own arguments. I'll have a link for that in the description as well. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure to let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts about what I've said in this video, and don't forget to roast me in the comments.